Let's start with our first past tense, the Präteritum. So, what is the Präteritum and how is it formed? The Präteritum is the German equivalent of the simple past in English. For example, I played soccer yesterday. That's the simple past. In English it is formed by taking the word stem and then adding the simple past ending, which most of the time is just ed. For example, played or cooked, for example. But there can also be some irregular endings, but more on that later. In German it's almost the same. Here we also take the word stem and then we add some endings. In this case not the simple past ending, but our Präteritum ending. For example, machte, wollte, and so on. But because in German we conjugate verbs, unlike English, we have an individual Präteritum ending for each grammatical person. They are te, test, te, ten, tet, and ten. If, for example, we take the verb spielen, to play, we first need to get its word stem. As we learned in an earlier lesson, we get the word stem by leaving out the ending en in the infinitive. Spielen is an infinitive, so we need to leave out the ending en. So we have Spiel, and Spiel is our word stem. And we now just need to add the Präteritum endings. So te, test, te, ten, tet, and ten. And then we get the following conjugation. Ich spielte, du spieltest, sie es spielte, wir spielten, ihr spieltet, sie spielten. Ich spielte, I played, du spieltest, you played, sie es spielte, he she it played, wir spielten, we played, ihr spieltet, you played, sie spielten, they played. Apart from the fact that in German verbs need to be conjugated, it's basically the same thing as in English. Just the word stem plus the Präteritum ending. Got it? Okay, then now it's your turn. In the following, I will be giving you a verb, for example, kochen, to cook, and your task is to conjugate the verb in the Präteritum. So in this particular case, you would need to reduce kochen to its verb stem, koch, and then you need to add the Präteritum endings. So the solution would be ich kochte, du kochtest, sie es kochte, wir kochten, ihr kochtet, and sie kochten. Ich kochte, du kochtest, sie es kochte, wir kochten, ihr kochtet, and sie kochten. Not that difficult, right? You just take the word stem and then add the Präteritum endings. With our next verb, you're on your own. This time we have the verb suchen, to search. Suchen. If you like, you can pause the video and try for yourself. The correct solution would be ich suchte, du suchtest, sie es suchte, wir suchten, ihr suchtet, sie suchten. The word stem of suchen is such, and then you just add the Präteritum endings. Ich suchte, du suchtest, sie es suchte, wir suchten, ihr suchtet, and sie suchten. Are you ready for one more? This time we will take the verb bauen, to build. Bauen. Again, if you like, you can pause the video and try for yourself. The correct solution would be ich baute, du bautest, sie es baute, wir bauten, ihr bautet, and sie bauten. The verb stem or word stem of bauen is bau, and then you just add the Präteritum endings te, test, te, ten, tet, and ten. And that's how you get the conjugation ich baute, du bautest, sie es baute, wir bauten, ihr bautet, and sie bauten. Not that difficult, right? And for most verbs, that's the way we do it. But German wouldn't be German if there wouldn't be some exceptions and some irregular verbs. In fact, in English you even have the same thing, and in English there are even some more irregular verbs. Let's take a look. Maybe you already heard of the three forms of irregular verbs in English. They are these forms like do, did, done, speak, spoke, spoken, and so on. They are basically the infinitive, the simple past form, and the past participle. And in English, there are actually a lot of these forms that are irregular. I mean, if do would be regular, it would be do, doed, doed. Or if speak would be regular, it would be speak, speaked, speaked. But it isn't. And the same thing also goes for German. Here we also have these three forms. The three forms of irregular verbs in German are die 3 Formen der unregelmäßigen Verben. Die 3 Formen der unregelmäßigen Verben. We also have the infinitive, then the Präteritum form, which corresponds to the simple past form in English, and the Partizip 2, which is the same as the past participle in English. So basically the same thing. And what's also cool about it is that basically the same verbs that are irregular in English are also irregular in German. In German they're a little less, but still most of the time it's the same verbs. For example, if you take the verb to do, as we just saw, the 3 forms would be do, did and done in English, and in German they would be tun, tat and getan. Do, did, done, tun, tat, getan. Or if we take speak, spoke, spoken, the German equivalent would be sprechen, sprach and gesprochen. Sprechen, sprach and gesprochen. What we now need for our Präteritum is the second form, in this case tat or sprach. I'll show you with the verb sprechen what I mean by that. If you want to conjugate the verb sprechen in the Präteritum, and as you know, sprechen is an irregular verb, you take a look at the 3 forms of sprechen, and you see that the Präteritum form is sprach. Now, unlike English, in German this still needs to be conjugated. But this time, the root of sprechen is not sprech, but sprach. So we take this Präteritum form and use it as our root. And then we just need to add the Präteritum endings, but there's a little catch. We just learned that for regular verbs, the Präteritum endings are st, t, ten, tet and ten. For irregular verbs, however, it's a little different. Here, the first and third person singular don't have an ending at all, so the root stays the same, as you can see in ich sprach and sie es sprach. And the other endings are st for the second person singular and then n, t and n in the plural. This may seem confusing right now, but the cool thing is, unlike the irregular verbs in the presens, here we don't have any exceptions. Once you know the 3 forms of the irregular verbs, die 3 Formen der unregelmäßigen Verben, it's actually fairly easy. And of course you can find a table with all of these 3 forms in the additional material. But let's stay with the example of sprechen. So we take sprach as our root, and then we add the irregular endings. So ich sprach, du sprachst, sie es sprach, wir sprachen, ihr spracht, and sie sprachen. Sprach is our root, and we use the endings on the right, the irregular endings. Let's have one more example. This time we'll take one of the most important verbs in German, haben, to have. The 3 forms of the verb haben are haben, hatte and gehabt. You see, it's an irregular verb. So the Präteritum form of the first person singular becomes our root. In this case, hatte. Ich hatte. What we're going to do now is add the endings for irregular verbs in the Präteritum. Ich hatte, du hattest, sie es hatte, wir hatten, ihr hattet, and sie hatten. One more time. You take hatte, the Präteritum form of the first person singular, and then you add the endings on the right, so the endings for the irregular verbs in the Präteritum. The first and third person singular don't get an ending at all, so we have ich hatte and sie es hatte. The second person singular gets the ending st, so we had du hattest, and our plural endings are in, t and n, so wir hatten, ihr hattet, and sie hatten. And this goes for all of the irregular verbs out there. There is no exception. Let's have one more example. The verb können. Können is also an irregular verb. The 3 forms of können are können, konnte, and gekonnt. As you know by now, the form that we need is the second one, konnte. So in order to be able to conjugate it, we take konnte as our verb stem, and then we add the irregular endings. So we conjugate it like this. Ich konnte, du konntest, sie es konnte, wir konnten, ihr konntet, and sie konnten. Ich konnte, du konntest, sie es konnte, wir konnten, ihr konntet, and sie konnten. Not that difficult, isn't it? Now it's your turn again. Based on what we've just learned, your task is to conjugate an irregular verb that I give you. I'll give you the infinitive of the irregular verb and its 3 forms. So for example, denken, to think, and the 3 forms of denken are denken, dachte, and gedacht. Based on that, how can you conjugate it? If you like, you can pause the video and try for yourself. The correct solution would be ich dachte, du dachtest, sie es dachte, wir dachten, ihr dachtet, and sie dachten. How do we get to that solution? First, you need to look for the Präteritum form of denken, which was dachte, dachte. Then you add the irregular endings, which you can see in the top right corner, and then you just add them. And you get ich dachte, du dachtest, sie es dachte, wir dachten, ihr dachtet, and sie dachten. It's as easy as that. Let's have one more, the verb kommen, to come. The three forms of kommen are kommen, kam, gekommen. Kommen, kam, gekommen. Based on that, how do you conjugate kommen in the Präteritum? If you like, you can pause the video and try for yourself. The correct solution would be ich kam, du kamst, sie es kam, wir kamen, ihr kamt, and sie kamen. We take the Präteritum form kam and then add the irregular endings. This gives us the forms ich kam, du kamst, sie es kam, wir kamen, ihr kamt, and sie kamen. So as you can see, the verbs that are irregular verbs, both in German and in English, are verbs that appear very often. As I already mentioned in the video about the presents, that's due to the fact that speakers are lazy, and most of the time the irregularities are things that make these verbs easier to pronounce, and that's how they formed. Are you up for the ultimate challenge? Let's have a look at the most difficult verb in German, sein, to be. The three forms of the verb sein are sein, war, and gewesen. Sein, war, gewesen. In English, be, was or were, and bin. Sein, war, and gewesen. Based on that, are you able to conjugate it? If you like, you can pause the video and try for yourself. If you manage to conjugate this verb, then congrats, then you're able to conjugate all of the verbs in the Präteritum. So, the correct answer would be ich war, du warst, sie es war, wir waren, ihr wart, and sie waren. The Präteritum form of sein is war. So what we need to do now is just take war as our root and then add the irregular endings. This gives us the conjugation ich war, du warst, sie es war, wir waren, ihr wart, and sie waren. If you did this correctly, then congrats, then you've mastered the Präteritum. It's not gonna get any more difficult than that. As you can see, as long as you know the three forms of the irregular verbs, things are actually pretty easy. But the problem about this is that you need to know the three forms. And in order to do so, in the additional material, you can find a detailed document where you can find the three forms of all the irregular verbs in German. Unfortunately, that's something that you should really learn by heart, because those verbs are really important. I needed to do the same thing for English, and English has even more irregular verbs than German. Once you know these three forms, the rest is actually not that difficult. And as you probably already noticed, the regular verbs are even easier. So now it's time for some more practice. In the following, we'll have a quiz on the regular verbs and the irregular verbs and some exercises around these topics. And once we're done with all of that, we will move on to our next past tense, the Perfekt. The most used past tense in German. Bis gleich. See you soon.